Afternoon, Dave.
Afternoon. So some really good news, because I know you guys were wondering about this. Actually, two bits of really good news. Number one, of course, this session is on, I think, before the football starts. Is that right? So we should be able to finish in plenty of time for that. And then number two, more importantly, we should be finished before Nadal takes the court. So I know you guys are really concerned about that. Before we get going, just because I know you guys are all thinking this, right? You have to be very quiet because I don't know how loud it is, but. Yeah, I don't. Please, I know you guys are all thinking that. Today, by the way, hello. My name is Daniel Vacanti. We're going to be talking about Titanic. Maybe not as much as you might think, but actually maybe more than you might think. Couple ground rules for my presentations. I like to make them extremely informal. So as we go through this, if you guys have questions, I do have some time reserved at the end to answer questions, but I would much rather take the questions as you guys have them. So if anything occurs to you, just shout it out, throw something at me, whatever you need to do to get my attention, and let's talk about it. And then, like I said, God willing, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation as well. I think I've got an hour, I think. So we'll try to, I know I'm in speaker no man's land, right? The session right after lunch, especially on the first day, so you guys are going to be hitting a food coma fairly quickly. So I'll try to keep this as interesting as possible. So please, it's much more fun if we talk about this stuff together. And more importantly, I'm going to be asking you guys a lot of questions. And for the most part, there's no right answer, so just please feel free to shout stuff out as it occurs to you. Okay? All right. How an expedite request sunk the Titanic. Everybody remembers the movie? Has everybody seen the movie? Yeah? Everybody remember this guy in the movie? Yeah, we're not going to be talking about him. We're going to be talking about this guy. This is the real Bruce Ismay, right? That's the actor Bruce Ismay. This is the real Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay. Oh, sorry. Did you want to get?
That's okay. Don't worry about me.
Bruce Ismay was the chairman of a company known as the White Star Line, right? And their whole job was to build ships. And round about the turn of the century, the White Star Line had actually slipped in its building of ships. And Bruce Ismay, came along and he was like, you know what? They had been overtaken both, I think, in terms of number and size as well as the number of ships that the White Star Line had put out. So Bruce Ismay came along, and he was like, I want to reestablish our dominance. I want to put out the biggest ships in the world. I want to build the biggest ships in the world, and that's exactly what he did. He set out to build what are known as the Olympic-class ships. There were 3 of them, right? The Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. For our purposes here, we're going to be talking obviously mostly about Titanic, but I really actually want to start with Olympic. Maybe you guys know this, maybe you don't, but Olympic was actually built first. Construction started in 1908 in Belfast. Any Northern Irish in the room today? No? Okay, good. So I can say that everybody knows. God knows why they went to Northern Ireland. Everybody knows that Scotland builds the best ships, right? Yeah. So Olympic was built in 1908, or it was started first, and it was placed into service in 1911. So Olympic was built first. Second came along was Titanic, everybody's favorite Titanic. Construction began in 1909, again in Belfast, with a tentative maiden voyage set, an original tentative maiden voyage date set of early 1912. Okay? Now, as construction neared completion on Titanic, they actually settled on a very specific initial sailing date, March 20th, 1912. Does anybody know, were they able to keep this date? Anybody? Turns out that they weren't, because what happened in February of 1912, before Titanic was complete, obviously, the Olympic, that was already in service, threw a rudder. And it had to go back into port for repairs. Right? They had to go back on to Belfast for repairs. Now, the company that built the ships was a company by the name of Harland and Wolff. They had the contract to build all of these ships. Now, they had all of their resources, obviously, they had all of their resources working on Titanic when Olympic comes back into port for repairs. So now they've got a decision to make, right? So I've got this Olympic, that's already in service, right? Every day that it sits in port, it's lost money, right? Because I'm not out there ferrying passengers around. And of course, if I take workers off of Titanic, finishing Titanic, to work on Olympic, that's obviously going to delay the completion of Titanic, right? Titanic, on the other hand, it's not finished yet, but of course, every day that it's not finished, it's not making any money. They've already put a huge investment in Titanic. And of course, allocating workers here would delay the completion of Olympic. So the question is, what do you do? What do you think these guys did? Or how would you go about making this decision? What do you think? Remember how I talked about just feel free to shout out your answers?
What can get back into service the quickest?
What's that?
What can get back into
What can get back into service the quickest? What if I told you that Olympic can get back into service the quickest?
Buy more people.
Buy more people? Yeah. The world that I live in, I don't know if this is the world that you live in, but the world that I live in, companies are usually firing half their staff and telling them to go twice as fast. But yeah, if you get more people, for sure.
To ask Bruce for priority?
Yeah? What decision do you think Bruce made?
Both.
Titanic? Both? Actually, both is closer to the answer. We'll get back. I have to keep you guys here for I'll give you the answer later in the talk. I have to keep you guys here somehow, right? So I'm hoping all of this sounds familiar, right? Imagine that you're working. Say this is your Agile board. For the sake of discussion, we'll call it a Kanban board. Imagine this is all of your work, and now we've got this expedite, this quote-unquote expedite that shows up that we absolutely have to get done right now. So we pull it in to progress, and the question immediately becomes, okay, now of all this stuff that's sitting here in analysis, which of those do we work on? What do you think is the best decision here? From a predictability perspective, what do you guys think is the best, how should we make this decision?
Eldest first.
Eldest first?
Most mature.
Most mature first?
Smallest first.
Value, smallest, okay. All good answers. So let's see. Why is this question so important? Let's talk about why this question is so important. Make sure, okay. What is the very first question that your customers are going to ask you once you start on work on something for them?
When is it going to be done?
Ready.
When will it be done? Right? That's the very first question that they're going to ask you. And for the most part, that's all they really care about until they get that value delivered. Now, it turns out that the answer to when will it be done, they're actually looking for a very, very, very specific answer to the question, when will it be done? When they ask you when will it be done, what are they looking for in terms of the answer? A date. They're looking for a date or possibly a number of days. It's worse than that. Because let's say it's December 1st, and I tell my customers that they're going to have something in 30 days. So it's December 1st, I tell them it's going to be something, they're going to have something in 30 days. When do you think they're expecting it? December 30th, certainly by the end of the year, right? They're not sitting there going, well, there's some weekends in there, and they're probably not working weekends. And of course, there's the Christmas holidays as well, and nobody really works over the Christmas holidays. So they say 30 days, but what they really mean is middle of January. I guarantee your customers are not thinking that way. They're thinking in terms of elapsed time, right? Okay. Luckily for us, we have a flow metric available to us that actually measures elapsed time. Does anybody know what the flow metric available to us that measures elapsed time is? Am I asking too many questions? Is it too soon after lunch to ask questions?
The Kuma's kick again.
Yeah. It's something that I'm going to call cycle time. We can have the lead time versus cycle time debate. That's maybe for beers afterward. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to call that measure of elapsed time cycle time. So I'm going to assume that in our process, for example, we have some definition of what we consider work to have started. We have some definition of what we consider items to have completed, departed, and the total measure of elapsed time, not active time, not work time, whatever, elapsed time is going to be a measure of what we're going to call cycle time. So what that means is, when something comes into our process, we're going to take a timestamp. I apologize for the American dates, by the way. These are American versions of the dates. So that's not January 9th. That's actually September 1st. So, of course, if I would have said anything, then you wouldn't have known, would you? Oh, we're going to do some math later, so actually you would have known. And when it exits the process, we're going to take another timestamp, and this is where it got confusing for you guys. No, this didn't take 9 months. Actually, it took It actually took 10 days. So our cycle time calculation is going to be very, very simple. We're going to take these two timestamps. We're going to take the time that it finished minus the time that it started. We're going to add 1. Why do you think I'm adding 1 here?
Slack.
Yep, say that louder. It's okay.
Slack.
Slack? No. I mean, say the right answer louder. Why plus 1? I thought I heard it. I thought I heard somebody say it.
Inclusive.
To make it inclusive, yes. Right? If something starts today and finishes today, what's that cycle time? It's not 0. I guarantee it's not 0. So we need to make it inclusive, so we do 1, right? If you track nothing else, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of homework, by the way. If you track nothing else out of this session, I want you just to track 2 things. Track the date that something starts and track the date that something finishes. You get those two bits of information. You can do pretty much any type of predictive stuff that you want to do, any type of forecasting really that you want to do, if you only have those 2 bits of information. We may want more, but at a minimum, that's really all you need. And I'll show you that in just a second. Right? Okay, that's going to give us this flow metric of cycle time. Right? And as I said, cycle time is a measure of elapsed time that it takes for a work item to complete. And of course, cycle time then is the answer to when will it be done for a single item. So when a customer comes to us and says, when will this user story be done? When will this defect be done? When will this whatever be done? For a single item, the metric that we're going to look at is cycle time. Okay? Now, what is, pop quiz, although this is probably my 13th question already, what is the biggest influencer of how long it takes stuff to get done? Of cycle time? What's the biggest influencer of cycle time? Size, maybe. Work in progress. Any other guesses? The answer is, of course, yes, work in progress. Turns out, and we can talk about all this stuff at the end, hopefully we have time. It turns out that honestly, size, relative complexity, effort, all of that stuff is actually a very, very, very poor predictor. When we're talking about elapsed time, remember we're talking about elapsed time, all of those things is a very, very poor predictor of how long it takes something to complete. The best predictor of how long it takes something to complete is how many other things you're working on at the same time. A work in progress, okay? Now, here's the more important question. I would argue maybe this is even more important. If we have, or once we have work in progress under control, what's the next biggest influencer of how long it takes something to get done?
Motivation.
Motivation? Yeah. Work harder? Break out the whips?
Resources.
What's that?
Resources.
Resources, number of resources, kinda.
Bottlenecks.
What's it, sorry?
Bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks, we're getting closer. You guys are all kind of circling around it a little bit.
Waiting time.
Capacity.
Let me, so this is all, they all are kind of, I was hoping for a little bit abstract, and it's okay that nobody really got this, because hopefully that's why you guys are all here. Believe it or not, the second biggest influencer, next to work in progress, the second biggest influence of how long it takes to get stuff done is this decision right here. How do we decide, once work has started, how do we decide the order that it comes through our process? This is, as I'm about to show you, this is going to have a huge impact. Just our basic decision rules around this order is going to have a huge impact on elapsed time, right? The order, my decision making around the order in which I pull stuff through the process is what I'm going to generically refer to for the rest of this talk as pull policies. These are your pull policies. If you don't have them defined, this is something that you need to define, but that's potentially for another talk. So your pull policies. Right? So to answer the when will it be done, and to understand the effect of how pull policies affect our ability to answer when will it be done, we need to take a look at cycle time data. Now, my favorite chart, this is Dan speaking, by the way, and I mean you should take my word for this stuff, but you shouldn't take my word for it. But my particular favorite chart to look at for cycle time is something known as a cycle time scatter plot. Now, for our purposes here, unfortunately, the cycle time scatter plot is not going to be useful to us. Unfortunately, we're going to have to use something else that I think is less useful generally, but more useful for this specific topic, and that's going to be a cycle time histogram. Hopefully everybody's seen a histogram before. What we're going to do is track cycle time, all of our cycle times across the bottom here, and then the frequency with which these cycle times occur, right, up the side. And if we do that, we are going to get a chart that looks like this. If you guys go in and do that, if you define a very specific start point, a very specific end point, measure cycle time and plot it on a histogram, you will get you'll get a histogram that looks something a lot like this. It'll have a big hump on the left and a long, thin tail out there on the right. Pretty much every cycle time process will look something like that. Okay? So now the question is, why does a cycle time histogram look like this? Why does it have this characteristic where there's all this stuff going on over here and all of this stuff, long tail, at the end? Why does it look like that, do you think? So let's try an experiment. Oh, sorry, did you want to go back to your guys? Yeah. Anybody know why it's cycle time? Just so I can ask. Is there beeping? Are you all hearing that?
Yes.
I'm sorry, is the noise in my head bothering you? Why does the cycle time histogram look like that? Because it can do more stuff. It can do more little stuff. Yeah, I mean, yeah, intuitively, it kind of feels like maybe this is little stuff that we're getting done quicker, and this is maybe bigger stuff that we're getting done. Maybe yes, maybe no. Why else?
It's the predictability of the system, isn't it?
Specifically, what about the predictability of the system?
The closer things are together, the less bigger lines, the more predictable the system. The
Yeah. In terms of how you read the histogram, yeah. If these lines are closer together, they're more predictable. Yeah, but why specifically does a cycle time histogram have a big hump on the left?
We have more smaller tasks.
Yeah, see?
Smaller is easier.
Yeah.
There's always more
I
to
know.
do than without years.
It seems like a lot of people have this idea of, I need to, hopefully by the end of the class, I was just almost said about that. By the end of the talk, I will have shaken you guys free of this sizing thing, because really elapsed time has almost nothing to do with sizing. So I want to lead you through a little experiment to kind of explain why these cycle time histograms look the way that they do. Okay, we are going to wave our magic wand, and we are going to be transported to this magical land where we can make every item that's flowing through our process take the exact same amount of active time to complete. Okay? Obviously, this isn't the real world, but this is the experiment. Does this make sense? So everything that moves through our process is going to take the exact same amount of active time to complete. So how long it takes for a developer to work on something or how long it takes for a tester to work on something, all is going to be the same. Okay? Make sense? This is going to be the process that we're going to move stuff through. Okay? We're going to have an analysis column, a dev column, and a test, and we're going to have these work in progress limits. They're going to be very, very important for our discussion here, because remember I said, very, very important to limit work in progress, okay? For our first round of this experiment, we're going to have 55 items in our backlog, okay? Now, all of these work items, as I just said, are going to need exactly 10 days of active time in each workflow stage. Okay, so 10 days in analysis, 10 days in dev, 10 days in test, okay? Active. There are going to be no other blocking events or added items, right? This truly is a magical, fun world that we live in, right? Okay? Make sense? This is our setup. So, at the end of day one, this is what our board's going to look like. Right? We've started our project. So we pulled in the first 2 items from our backlog. At the end of day one, they're in analysis, right? At the end of day 10, those 2 items that were in analysis finished, but because there was nothing in dev, they could immediately move to dev active, and we pulled in 2 items behind it. Yeah? Okay? At the end of day 20, our board is going to look like this. Now we got a bit of a problem. What's the problem that we got?
Bottlenecking test.
So yeah, we only have, I'm going to shy away from the term bottleneck for a while. We only have, we only have work in progress limit of 1 and test, but we got 2 things here, waiting and done. Now we need to decide which one of those do we pull. Okay? So let's run various experiments about this in terms of which one of these do we pull. Right? In the first case, we are going to work all these items through in a very, very strict FIFO queuing order. Items are not going to be allowed to go out of order. So we're going to work them in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 order. Okay? So that means at the beginning of day 21, we pull in item 1. When item 1 finishes, we'll pull in 2. When 2 finishes, we'll pull in 3. Okay? Makes sense? The question is, what do you think our cycle time is if we do that in this process? And we want to think in terms of the 85th percentile. I wish I had time to go into probabilistic forecasting. Unfortunately, I don't. But if we said that 85% of our items, 85%, how long is it going to take for 85% of our items to get through? What's the range that we're going to have? What do you guys think? Anyone? What's the minimum it could be? 30 days. Do you think it's going to be 30 days?
45.
45 is a good guess. Anyone else? It's okay. There are no wrong answers. I mean, there are. But there are no wrong answers.
60 days.
60 days? All good guesses? If we track that in a histogram like I was talking about before, remember this is FIFO queuing with no expedites. This is what our histogram will look like. 85% of our items will actually get done in 50 days or less. That's strict FIFO queuing, right? Remember, no other expedites, no interrupts, no anything. Okay? Remember that one. Now, we're going to say, instead of FIFO queuing, we're going to use random queuing. So what I mean by that is, when there are 2 here, we're literally going to flip a coin. Right? Heads is 1, tails is 2. Every time there's 2 here, we're just going to flip a coin to decide which one. Right? Total random queuing. We're changing nothing else. Nothing else is changing except we're randomly deciding which 2 to work on. What do you guys think that this is going to do to our cycle time? So before it was strict FIFO, it was 50. Do you guys think in this world it's going to be more or less?
The same.
Less, same, and more. That's all of our options. What do you got? So, anybody feel strongly about more or less?
I think
Or
more
same?
because it means that newer items can get through the test before the old zone.
Yeah.
And so that gets the longest.
I'm gonna take my jacket off here, guys, because you're making me work for this, right? I'm from Miami, and so I'm not used to the heat that you guys have. I mean, honestly, I think it is warmer here than it is in Miami this week. Okay, so we've got some strong opinions about more. This is what our histogram looks like. Remember, everything was the same. All we did was change our decision-making process. This is what our histogram looks like now. Looks a little bit more like what I was showing you before. Our 85th percentile is now 60 days. So just by changing that one policy, we added 10 days to our cycle time in our magical world of, right? All right, gets even better. Now, the next case we're going to do is we're going to go back to strict FIFO queuing, okay? But in this world of FIFO queuing, we're always going to make sure there is always one expedite on the board, okay? And the expedite gets to violate work in progress limits. And whenever there's an expedite in the column, we are always going to choose that expedite. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep.
So when we have a case like this, you see this expedite got to violate that work in progress limit, and when there are 3 things in there like this, we are always going to choose that green expedite. All right? What do you think this is going to do to cycle time? Hopefully you're noticing a pattern here. Just wondering. Yes. What do you guys think?
Increase it.
By how much? It increases it by how much? 10? Did you say 10 days? Sorry. Good guess.
Could be more.
You guys were talking a lot when you came into there. This is our histogram. Looks a little bit more predictable, but our 85th percentile is now 65 days. So again, all we're changing is our pull policies here. We went from 50 to 60 to 65. Now the one that you guys were all hoping for, because my guess is this is the one that most closely mimics how you guys do work right now. There's always going to be an expedite on the board, and we're just going to be randomly pulling stuff. But the expedite rules still apply. Whenever that expedite is there, we're always going to choose the expedite. If the expedite's not there, we're just going to randomly choose one. Okay, make sense? Does this sound familiar to you guys? Probably, this is how, when I go into companies, this is usually how they're working right here. Okay? What do you guys think that this is going to do to our cycle time?
Yeah, isn't it 80 days?
It's going to go 80 days, so we went from 50 to 60 to 65, now we think maybe 80? 70? Anyone else? This, of course, is the worst of both worlds. Does this histogram look familiar to you now? Right? Our 85th percentile now is 100 days. So we essentially doubled our cycle time from that very first case. Right? And you can see we have a histogram that looks more like what I was showing you before. So let's just review here. Those, I know that's kind of hard to see, that red's kind of hard to see. We went from 50 to 60 to 65 to 100. These are the histograms. You see how these histograms kind of evolve into that shape that I was showing you before. This is mostly due to those pull policies. There's a real world example, just very quickly I want to show you. This is a company I worked with several years ago. When we went in and just mined their cycle time data, they of course had no work in progress limits, no pull policies. This is their histogram that showed up. The width from the smallest value to the highest value of their cycle time is 185 days. And the max height of one of these bars was 30 items. So it's actually a very flat histogram. Very flat, very wide histogram. We came in, honestly, all we did, we changed nothing else. We limited work in progress, and we put in place some better pull policies. And this is the same histogram from the same team. Now the max width is 90 days, and the max height of an item, of a cycle time, is 62. These are the two histograms side by side. So you can see as we introduce predictability into the process, that histogram shrinks. I think as somebody suggested earlier, that histogram shrinks and it gets taller. Okay? What this means is you really can't think of cycle time as a single number. When somebody asks you what the cycle time of your process is, cycle time is really a random variable. Think of it as a shape. You want to think of, whenever you hear random variable, you want to think of cycle time as a shape. The cycle time of my process looks like this histogram. It's not a single individual value, it's a shape. And so because of that, what that means is we want to think about, when it comes to predictability, we want to think about what does it mean, how do we focus on affecting the shape of your cycle time distribution, right? So what factors affect shape? We just went over two. What are two factors that affect shape? What's the first one? Limited work in progress. And the second one, I just gave you the answer for? Pull policies. So what pull policies should you use for predictability? When we're talking about predictability, what pull policy should we use? What do you think is the best pull policy? Believe it or not, it's not necessarily FIFO. Not necessarily FIFO, because in the real world it's really hard to get to strict FIFO queuing. Believe it or not, the best pull policy is something called first in, first served, or as somebody suggested before, the heuristic is all other things being equal, you're just pulling the one that's been in there the longest. Right? It may not be a strict FIFO, but all other things being equal, it's the one that's been there the longest. The way that you know the one that's been in there longest is the most important chart that you've never heard of. I'm guessing probably most of the people in this room have never heard of this chart. And it's probably the most important chart when it comes to managing work that I know of. Can anybody guess what this chart is?
Never heard it.
So you're probably thinking, it was a cumulative flow diagram, it's not a cumulative flow diagram. It's not cycle time scatter plot, it's not cycle time histogram. It's something that is known as a work in progress aging chart. Right? So before, on that scatter plot, remember I showed you that cycle time scatter plot where there were a whole bunch of dots on there? Every one of those dots on that cycle time scatter plot represented an item that had finished. We finished an item, we calculated the cycle time, and then we plotted it. All the dots on this chart now represent the items that are in progress. Across the bottom are all our workflow stages: analysis active, analysis done, dev active, dev done, testing done. Right? And now each dot represents an item that is in that workflow stage, and the height of the dot represents how long it has been in progress. Not how long it's been in a given stage, but how long it's been in progress total. So for example, there's a dot here in analysis done. You can see there's an item in analysis done that has been in progress a total of 10 days. Okay? Now, age in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Things age all the time. So what we need is some objective measure of has something aged too long? And that's what these percentile lines are. And unfortunately, I probably don't have enough time. If we have time, I can maybe go back and explain how these percentile lines are calculated. But that's what these percentile lines are telling us are an objective measure of if something's been in progress so far. We actually get these right off of that cycle time scatter plot, or potentially the cycle time histogram. But right here, you see this line right here is the 50th percentile. And I don't know if you can see, it says 7 days. So for those of you in the back, that's 7 days at the 50th percentile. Now, what that means is, of all the items that have flowed through our process before and finished, 50% of them completed in 7 days or less. What that also means is, as items age, and in particular, when they start crossing these lines, we gain information about them. So if I have an item in progress that's aging and it gets to that 7 days, that 7-day mark, what that tells me is that this particular item or these items are taking longer, potentially bigger, than half the things we've seen before. Half the things that we've worked on before have actually finished by now. These are still in progress. Why? It's a question we should ask is why? Do we need to break it up? Do we need to swarm on it? Do we need to change acceptance criteria? Do we need to do whatever? Right? Now it becomes kind of basic project management type stuff. But there's actions that we need to take because this is giving us a pretty early signal that stuff is going bad. And as these things get older and older and older, those conversations should become more urgent. Right? Because the last thing we want is for an item to be stuck in our process forever. Right? Somebody somewhere is waiting for these things to get done. As I mentioned before, it's even worse than that. Because as you guys may have figured out, if stuff ages more on the left side of this chart, the longer it spends in these columns, the higher chance it has of taking too long to get through our process. Right? So we even want another dimension to this chart, so we can overlay on top of it something that I would call what we call pace percentiles. And so we can see what these colors represent is how long items that have flowed through these columns before, how long they've taken to finish that column. And now you can see by looking at that, obviously the stuff up more toward the top, the orange and the red, is in trouble, whereas the stuff that's more down in the green area is probably flowing properly. You can see how you could leverage this maybe in a stand-up every day, or if you're doing Scrum, a daily Scrum. I get my wrist slapped every time I talk to Scrum people and I call it a stand-up. I get very, very upset about that, which is okay. But so now, instead of going through and doing a status meeting at your stand-up or your daily Scrum and talking about everything that's on your board or everything that everybody's working on, we can say on our aging chart, you know what? The stuff that's down here on the green, in the green area, is pretty much flowing the way that we expect it to. So we probably shouldn't waste any time on that. However, the stuff that's up here in the red and potentially, in the orange, that stuff is in danger or is in serious trouble. So we should probably invest our time looking at that, and maybe even the stuff that's kind of on the boundary of yellow and orange or whatever. Those are the items that we need to pay attention to, because if we ignore them, they're just going to age and they're going to totally affect our cycle time, or ultimately affect our cycle time. Is this making sense? I'm getting a lot of blank.
Yeah, do you focus on the items or do you focus on the process?
So on a day-to-day tactical basis, so a stand-up I would say is a very tactical meeting. So on a day-to-day tactical basis, I would focus on the items.
Yeah.
But you can imagine this is absolutely data that we're going to want to look like in a retrospective, which I think is a little bit more strategically based. And we would say, okay, there might be problems with our process. There's probably
and whip limits and things. And
whatever, yeah, whatever it is. But like for any given day, it's like, what do we need to do? Like these, I don't know if you guys can see, there's 7 items right there. If I was running this team, I'd want to know what are we as a team going to do to get those items completed. Yeah.
Can I just ask, I can see how it's really powerful and it's really good information that you want to use, but I could also see problems in just collecting that kind of data with physical boards and something like that. just tracking those kind of data points to get that information out. How do you find that and getting?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure Duke can do it all for you. But
So the question, the question is, how do we collect this data, especially in a physical board? Let me answer the question you didn't ask first, of course. That's what I'm supposed to do. If you're using an electronic tool, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, I'm using an electronic tool, easy. Now, that's not even necessarily so easy too. Don't get me started on Jira. Don't get me started on Jira. But it's not as straightforward as you might think, even with an electronic board. But it is a little bit easier. On a physical board, you might be thinking, oh my God, how am I going to get this data on a physical board? Yes, it's probably going to take a little bit of motivation from the team's perspective, but if you're using a physical board and a team is going up to the board and moving a ticket anyway, it's not too much more effort to go right on that ticket, you have to write directly on that ticket the date that it changed, each transition
and you
right
think
there.
it's the date, not, are we looking at days moving through stasis rather than hours? How are you? You see any need to go any more granular?
Well, obviously the granularity is going to depend on your process. If you have stuff that's moving through in literally hours and minutes, maybe that, and at that point,
Maybe
yeah.
do we just, if that goes under in the day, that's fine, right?
Maybe, yeah, maybe the lowest granularity you have is one day, maybe. If you have really long-lived items, you might want to do, granularity maybe even weeks. You know, it's totally going to depend. For the most part, if at the very least you just track that timestamp that it moves through each step, then you can defer that granularity decision till later, because we're probably going to have to put all this stuff in a spreadsheet anyway. And at that point, we can decide, are we going to look at days, are we going to look at weeks, are we going to look at hours, you know, whatever. Right? Sorry, did that answer? Yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead.
So, I've got a question. So if we go with policy of first in, first served, but then we're changing our focus into concentrating on those work items which are in orange or red, how does that impact our policy of first in, first served?
The heuristic, when we talk about first in, first served, that's just a fancy name for the heuristic of choose the oldest item first. So that's really it. So I mean, that's really why you want to focus on the stuff that's been. So for example, if these items were over here in analysis done, they'd probably be the ones that I'd be looking at even more than say those, potentially. You see what I'm saying? Is this what you're asking? Am I answering your question? Or not?
I suppose part of it, yeah, it's you need to let you finish what you're going to say, and then.
Okay, you guys just want to hear about the Titanic, right? You guys just it's like, oh my God, Dan, just get to the answer. Yeah,
I'd forgotten.
Bring on the sinking.
I'd forgotten about the Titanic.
I blew you guys away. That was my sleight of hand. Yeah, think about. I hope I can answer your question later. Okay. So these simple decisions. I hope I've sold you guys on this. Maybe yes, maybe no. But these simple decisions have a huge impact, and potentially the biggest impact on your overall predictability. Right? And you might think about. This is Dan on the soapbox, so just forgive me. But you might think about maybe some of the advice you've been given about. Introducing expedite lanes onto your board and having specific classes of service and things like that. I'm hoping you're at least questioning that. I'm not saying it's necessarily good advice. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad advice. I'm saying that there is evidence to suggest from a predictability perspective that there might be a different way to consider how we work. Okay, so when last we left the Titanic, we were in this quandary. Given this, what do you think that Harlan and Wolff should have chosen? From a predictability perspective, what should they have chosen?
Titanic.
Titanic, right? Titanic? Everybody agree Titanic?
There would never have been a film if they hadn't.
What's that?
There wouldn't have been a film.
Yeah, does anybody know what they chose? Anybody guess? Olympic, yes. Right? What they did is they pulled a whole bunch of people off of Titanic to go work on Olympic. That was the prioritization. That was the pull policy that they used. Let's talk about why that had such a huge impact on history. So remember I said Titanic had an initial set sailing date, maiden voyage date, of March 20th. Does anybody know when it actually sailed? Yeah, April 10th. So they took a delay of about 3 weeks, which in and of itself doesn't sound like a big deal, right? Except for a couple things. When you look at iceberg activity in the North Atlantic, there's actually tons more icebergs in April than there are in March. That 3-week delay completely changed the risk profile of striking an iceberg, specifically in 1912. This blue line right here represents iceberg activity in 1912. Had they sailed in March, right, this is it. Sailing in April, that's what that looks like. Right? It gets worse. Right? Because they had, I don't know if you guys remember the captain from the Titanic movie. He's a real life character, actually, believe it or not. And he was their most experienced captain, and he was the one that always took out their new ships. So when he took out Titanic, because the Olympic was actually, believe it or not, the Olympic didn't finish first. Titanic actually finished first, even though they took people off Titanic to finish Olympic. Titanic still finished first. And so the captain was like, all right, the Olympic crew is in port, and the Titanic crew is in port, so I get my pick of all the best officers, you know, in the White Star Line. So what he did was he said, you know what? The chief officer of Titanic, this is the new crew for Titanic, the chief officer of Titanic, I'm going to steal from the Olympic. Because this guy, he hadn't been a chief officer before, so I'm going to steal that chief officer from the Olympic. Okay? This chief officer that I had selected before for Titanic is now going to be my first officer. Right? This first officer that I had before is now going to be my second officer. And this second officer, I'm just going to ask him to go home. Okay? So this is what he did. No big deal, right? Except that it turns out one of the duties of the second officer is to keep the locker where all the binoculars are for the lookouts. That second officer that was asked to go home forgot to hand in the keys to the binocular case. Right? And so, if you guys remember this scene in the movie, what don't these guys have? They don't have their binoculars. It is widely believed that had the lookouts had binoculars, that they would have seen that iceberg much, much, much sooner and had enough time to actually change course. Right? So, to sum up, we're not done yet. To sum up, most of the unpredictability in your process is due down to your poor pull policy. Say that 10 times fast. In general, it is better to finish work already started before starting new work, in general. And ask yourself, does the work that I'm expediting really need to be expedited? Or do I even have policies in place on how to decide what to expedite? Because you're killing your predictability if you don't. Right? Unpredictability manifests itself in 2 ways: longer and less reliable cycle times, and unintended consequences caused by delay of those items, as in the Titanic, right? They had no idea that all those icebergs were going to be out there, but because they took that delay, it brought all of this other stuff into play that they couldn't have foreseen. All right, here's what I'm not saying, just to be clear. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there's no such thing as an expedite. I'm definitely not saying that. There are such things as expedites. But what I am saying is that you have to be very, 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 very choosy in terms of what you call an expedite. An expedite should be a rare thing. There shouldn't always be an expedite on your board. If you walk up to their board, 99% of the time there should not be an expedite on there. If every time you walk up to the board there's one expedite and probably more like 30 expedites on your board, guess what? You know, you got problems. Okay, one last thing. This is kind of an interesting thing too that has to do with this pull policies. You guys remember these guys? These are the radio operators of Titanic. Right? And they essentially had 2 jobs. Anybody know what the radio operators' jobs were on Titanic?
Operate the radio?
Yes, operate the radio, yes.
Wanted to speak to other ships.
Yes, to speak to other ships.
See what
icebergs are in
Yep, so they were there, one of their jobs was to relay iceberg warnings to the captain. These are the radio and, I guess, telegraph operators, I should say, radio and telegraph operators. So one was to get those ice warnings and relay those ice warnings to the captain. Anybody happen to know what their other one is? Their other one was?
Communicating the course.
Communicating the course, yeah. The second, well, I'm talking about the second biggest, actually the first biggest draw on their time.
Celebrity tweeting.
Believe it or not, it actually was celebrity, it was a form of celebrity tweeting. The rich passengers on, because this is really the beginning of being able to send ship-to-shore messages.
You Trump somehow.
Yeah. So the rich people would come along and they would pay them to send messages to their buddies in New York or back in London. Now what's interesting is these telegraph operators were not, even though they're in uniform, they weren't actually employed by White Star Line. The way they made their money was by sending these messages. Right? Now, and they obviously had a huge backlog of messages to send. So now if the way that you're paid is by sending these messages and not relaying iceberg warnings to the captain, what do you think you would prioritize? What do you think you would choose? Pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
So they didn't relay iceberg warnings to him. They were paying attention to these rich people. My understanding is the very last iceberg warning that reached the hands of the captain was at 5:30 p.m. and Titanic struck the iceberg around 11:30. So 6 hours. They had 6 hours of iceberg warnings that actually never made it into the hands of the captain because these guys were too busy doing their celebrity tweeting. Something else to think about. For next time, if I get invited back, I usually have to question if I'm going to be invited back, but instead of this, I get to do a shameless plug. I'm actually doing another talk tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about what does a 19th century Yorkshire cotton industrialist have to do with the Manhattan Project. If you guys want to learn about that, please come back tomorrow. It's even better. 2 books that you may be interested in, written by the world's best author on these topics. A book called When Will It Be Done? And a book called Actual Agile Metrics for Predictability, both on LeanPub. Are there any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes for questions, but of course I'm happy to give you 10 minutes back on your calendar. Or, sorry, diary. Calendar, diary, you guys see? Diary? Questions?
On the chart earlier, when you were saying 50% of it looked like everything was slipping because you hadn't made it 100%. How do you decide 50%? When does that change? Because clearly the project you had running there, that 50% wasn't the cycle time of that project.
Yeah.
Well, at that point it wasn't anyway.
Let me just do this. You guys want to hear a little bit more YouTube? No? Let me see if this works. Okay, so the way that you get, so the question was, if I understood the question properly, how do we know what this 50th percentile is? And the way that you know that, I hope I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. Let me turn off that, and let me turn off that. This is the cycle time scatter plot. So very quickly, cycle time scatter plot is, this is time across the bottom, timeline across the bottom, cycle time up the side. Every time an item finishes our process, we go find the day that it finished, calculate the cycle time, and put a dot where that cycle time should be. So all these dots represent stuff that is finished, flow through our process and finished. Okay? The way that you come up with these percentiles off of this chart is you literally count up all the dots on this chart. To make the math easy, let's say there's 100. So if there's 100 dots on this chart, I want to go up the side here, and I want to find a cycle time such that if I draw a horizontal line all the way across this chart, it's going to cut the number of dots exactly in half. 50 dots will be above, 50 dots will be below. In this particular example, for all the data that we have, that 50th percentile happens at 7 days. Okay? So of all the items that flow through and finished, that's 7 days. And we can do that same calculation for various percentiles. In this example, I've got it for the 70th, the 85th, and the 95th. What you do then is you take those percentiles, those exact percentiles, and you overlay them on top of the aging work in progress, because we constantly want to be evaluating the stuff that we're working on right now, constantly evaluate that relative to stuff that we've completed in the past.
That's compared to a sample. So you've got a sample from before.
It could be a sample or it could be everything.
Everything from before, but obviously this is, in future, will be including everything, and that's going to drag it up.
So these percentile lines are just stuff in the past. There's nothing in the future there.
Right.
Oh, but you're saying...
You've got some work in progress.
Yeah.
Work in progress today will be work in the past.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons why... I'm using this. Anybody else hearing BP? Okay. I never knew. Great question. That's potentially the biggest reason why I choose a percentile approach. Were most people expecting me when I was explaining this to show like an average and a standard deviation? Has anyone ever seen that where you draw plus or minuses? No?
Yeah.
So I don't know if is that a yes? The reason you don't use things like averages and standard deviations to calculate this stuff is because averages, well, all kinds of reasons. Let me give you two. The first one is something known as the flaw of averages. Has everyone ever heard of the book, The Flaw of Averages? More homework for you. You have to read this book. If you read any book on this topic, read something called The Flaw of Averages, written by Dr. Sam Savage. The basic premise of the book is plans based on average fail on average. That's the basic premise of the book. That's the reason number one why you don't use averages. Reason number two is that averages are very susceptible to outliers. So you guys have probably heard the classic joke. If Bill Gates walks into a pub, then on average, everybody in the pub is a millionaire. Right? That's why we don't. That's why in this percentile world, percentiles are very robust in the face of outliers. So even if we were to have another dot, this highest dot right here is 40-something days. Even if we were to have a dot that were to come in and say 400 days, 10 times as much, an average would be totally skewed by that. But if that dot showed up on this chart, those percentile lines wouldn't budge. So it would have to take a really completely fundamental shift where we're getting a lot of these dots that are taking more time. But to your point, this is something that we should be looking at. Can I show you guys one other thing? You guys mind? You guys don't want to go to the next talk, right? Let me just show you one, because this is where it is relevant. Talk amongst yourselves. Rhode Island is neither a road nor an island. Discuss. So this is kind of more, I think, to your point. Looking at this scatter plot, my favorite question to ask in the scatter plot, can anybody tell me when Dan came in and did Kanban training for this team? Anyone? Yeah, right about here, this is about October 1st. And if you were to go look at these, if we were going to zoom in.
I thought it was the 1st of January, you're confusing me now.
Oh, I changed, for you guys, I changed these to UK, those are UK dates now, sorry. If we were to go in and zoom in on this bit here, you see that 85th percentile is 33 days, right? Now, if I just pay attention, by the way, pay attention to these percentile lines as I move forward slowly, because this is really kind of your point. As I just kind of zoom forward slowly, you see how those percentile lines are starting to come down, until we get there. And this is your point. We should be reviewing this stuff every so often. If you guys are doing retrospectives, this is one of the things I think you should be looking at in your retrospective. Once we get to this point here, though, if I zoom forward and you look at those percentile lines, you see they bounce around maybe a day or two here and there, but for the most part, you know, they're just flat. Right? That's how I would define a very predictable system. This, by the way, this chart, by the way, is one of the biggest reasons why I prefer scatter plots over histograms. Because if you were to look at a histogram here, when did Dan come and do his Kanban training? I don't know. Sorry, that was more than you wanted, but I hope that helps. How much time do I have? Do I have 4 minutes? Any other questions? Yeah, forward. Yeah. Oh wait, no, you don't get to ask questions.
Dan, we were speaking on how important is it for the context of the story or the spree over this data?
How important is the idea of a sprint? I'm hoping I've got this. Look at this one. This is probably the one. if we look at this scatter plot, is there a kind of a pattern that you see that kind of emerges on this scatter plot?
Yeah.
What's that pattern? It's a little subtle. It's not as dramatic as I'd like it to be.
Repeatability.
What's that?
Vertical bars?
These vertical bars, you see how there's like right here, there's a whole bunch of stuff getting done. Right here, there's a whole bunch of stuff getting done. And right here, there's a whole bunch of stuff getting done. What do you think those are?
Retrospective disc.
Housekeeping.
So I mean this is kind of I hope this is what you're talking about is yes, I mean this can tell if you had a team that literally opened every PBI at the beginning of the sprint and literally closed every PBI at the end of the sprint, your scatter plot would just be these straight lines of dots, every 14 days or every 30 days or whatever. And so yes, the context could be very, very, very important because that's going to influence what your scatter plots look like. I like to say, actually I get this from a friend of mine, his name is Frank Vega, but he says, our policies shape our data and our data shape our policies. Right? So if we're doing Scrum, we have a policy that we're releasing every 2 weeks, that's probably going to show up in our data. Right? But then that should also, the fact that we have that data might influence us to take some action in terms of, might we want to change that policy and release multiple times a sprint? There's nothing in Scrum that says you can't release multiple times a sprint, right? As I'm learning. Questions? I know I ramble. You guys should maybe is that why you're not asking questions? Because like, oh my God, you're just going to get on a soapbox, you're going to ramble. Yeah, sorry. 2 minutes. Sorry. Anything else? Yeah.
It's not really a question, it's a great talk, but I don't know if you know, but they actually released all of the communications from the radio as a set of tweets, I think, from the Titanic. You can go and read them all.
Oh, yeah. Is that in Belfast in the Titanic Museum?
Yeah, it was fairly recently, a couple of years ago.
It's fascinating. It's like, hey, yeah, I'm doing fine. Family and kids are loving it, right? Yeah. Well, that iceberg thing, don't worry about it. Nothing to see here. Probably should. Too soon? All right, well, let's, let me just do this. Let me fast forward to the end. All the stuff that I wanted to get to, but I'm not going to. My contact information, feel free to follow me on Twitter, although I'm normally just complaining about the tennis, especially when Nadal loses. But feel free to follow me on Twitter. These are my contact details if you guys have any questions. Would love to hear from you. Other than that, thank you very much for coming. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you didn't stick to me.